Okay. All right. I'm starting all over. My name is Erik Arneson. I am a past master of Ashland Lodge number 23 and Esoterica Lodge number 227, the Grand Lodge, Ancient Free and Accepted Masons of Oregon. I'm really excited actually to be presenting to you guys. This is probably one of the bright points of the whole pandemic is the way that it has brought Masons across the country together to share education and give talks to each other and all this sorts of stuff. So, thank you guys a lot for having me. I've been aware of Hibiscus Lodge for about 10 years because of the collections of papers that you guys are publishing, which was super awesome. I hope that you guys start that up again. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about a symbol out of the Entered Apprentice degree that I think gets overlooked a lot, or the importance of it gets overlooked a lot, which is Jacob's Ladder. I'm going to talk about the role of Jacob's Ladder in the craft degrees. Then we're going to take a look at how Jacob's Ladder has been interpreted in the past by sources that are pre-Masonic. And then we're going to look at some influences from other traditions that have the same sort of ladder of virtue concept that Freemasonry seems to have adopted. And finally, we're going to take a look at some of the works of Brother Benjamin Franklin and how he talked about ways that Masons can start to work with the Jacob's Ladder concepts on their own. So Jacob's Ladder in Freemasonry goes back pretty far. You can see here, this is a pretty common tracing board. I think this is one of those really common Masonic images that everybody's kind of familiar with. And I believe it's from the early 20th century. So this particular image isn't very old. However, the first instance of the Jacob's Ladder that I found mentioned in Freemasonry, just on like the most cursory of searches, which means that there's probably older stuff, comes from Brother Christopher Wren's Catechism from 1685, which is about 30 years before the Premier Grand Lodge of England started. And in the Catechism, it was basically a question and answer thing that went kind of like this: what is the covering of a Masonic lodge? A celestial canopy of diverse colors. How do we hope to arrive at it? By the help of a ladder. What is it called in Scripture? Jacob's Ladder. How many rounds or staves are in that ladder? Rounds or staves innumerable, each indicating a moral virtue, but three principal ones called faith, hope, and charity. This, one of the things that you guys should definitely be paying attention to as we go through this is the way that the rounds or staves or rungs of the ladder are described in these various sources, because sometimes people point out a specific number of rungs and sometimes they don't, and that tends to be kind of important in the way Jacob's Ladder is interpreted. But probably the most famous mention of Jacob's Ladder comes from William Preston's Illustrations of Masonry in 1793. And this is probably going to sound really familiar to you guys. I don't know how, I've never read any of Florida's ritual work, but I do know that this particular lecture, which William Preston sort of published as a public version of the Fellowcraft lecture, or the Entered Apprentice lecture, has been adopted by a lot of Grand Lodges as part of their sort of like secret work. So it wasn't secret in the 1790s. It was published in a very widely republished book. And it goes like this: our institution is said to be supported by wisdom, strength, and beauty, because it is necessary that there should be wisdom to contrive, strength to support, and beauty to adorn all great and important undertakings. Its dimensions are unlimited, and its covering no less than the canopy of heaven. To this object the Mason's mind is continually directed, and thither he hopes at last to arrive by aid of the theological ladder, with which Jacob in his vision saw ascending from earth to heaven, the three principal rounds of which are denominated faith, hope, and charity, and which admonish us to have faith in God, hope in immortality, and charity to all mankind. And this particular bit of lecture has been was reproduced quite a bit, including in Webb's illustrations of masonry in America, and was sort of a core element of influencing the way Oregon Masonic ritual got started. So this plate here that we're looking at is an engraving from, I think, mid 1800s. I believe it was either the 1870s or 1880s printing of Webb's Masonic Monitor. And I want to point out a couple of really interesting things. So the text itself just names these three principal rounds or principal rungs: faith, hope, and charity. In the Christopher Wren, in the 1685 version of this, it said that the rungs of the ladder are innumerable, that you can't even count them. And Preston doesn't even try to count. He just says that there are three main ones: faith, hope, and charity. So I want to take a couple looks. I want to take a look at this particular image because it's really fascinating. We're going to talk about Jacob's ladder in the Bible in a little bit, and we'll talk about what that says. But before we get there, let's take a look and see some of the images in this. So first of all, we've got Jacob sleeping down here. I think you can see my mouse pointer. And interestingly enough, you will see that he is resting on a cubic stone, or a perfect ashlar. This is something that is never mentioned in any of the public versions of our ritual, or at all in Oregon ritual. I don't know how it is in other places, but I've never seen this mentioned before. But it is a very common theme in Masonic depictions of Jacob sleeping at the bottom of his ladder. In the Bible, it does say that he finds a rock and makes it into his pillow. But in Freemasonry, apparently, it is the perfect ashlar that becomes the pillow. So on the ladder itself, you see these emblems which represent faith, hope, and charity. Faith being the shield, hope the anchor, and charity the winged heart that is also on fire. And then if you go further down at the bottom, this is really hard to make out unless you look at it up close, are letters representing the four cardinal virtues: temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. These four cardinal virtues are also really strongly featured in the public portion of the Entered Apprentice lecture, and together, all seven of those virtues are sort of the core theme around which a lot of the Entered Apprentice lessons are taught. And so this inclusion of these four cardinal virtues, and only these four cardinal virtues, tends to be really, really common in Masonic artwork featuring Jacob's ladder. And why is that? I have a theory about it, which I will get to in a little bit. But before we do that, I would remind you guys to think or ponder perhaps some of the other sets of seven that we come across in Freemasonry. Probably the big one is the seven liberal arts and sciences, which I'll talk about a little bit later. All right. So in the Bible, Jacob's ladder shows up in Genesis 28:12. And this is happening while Jacob is on a journey. I'm going to read part of it. Jacob went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head, and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set upon the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, Jehovah stood above it, and said, I am Jehovah, the God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee whithersoever thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. And Jacob waked out of his sleep, and he said, Surely Jehovah is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid, and said, How dreadful is this place! It is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. There's a couple of reasons why I read that whole passage. First of all, right at the end, that little bit about the house of God should resonate really strongly with Masons who hear that language a lot in the ritual, where we talk about, becoming elements in the house of God, or being part of the building of the house of God. And I think that there's a really powerful message here, where there's a promise of Jacob's ladder, of like the work of Jacob's ladder, um, turning your efforts into something that can be as the dust of the earth, that can spread abroad and be sort of like a universal covering for the earth. And I think we'll see that reflected a little bit, but in addition, it sort of really, I believe, impacts the way that Jacob's ladder, which ends up being sort of a ladder of virtue, which Masons are expected to climb, sort of teaches us that our teachings and our lessons and the way that we can work to be better people is something that kind of like influence the entire world. So Jacob's ladder, and in fact, it's part of the Torah, and the Torah is, one of the most influential books in Western society, and it gets interpreted and reinterpreted over and over and over again. And I'm going to just look at a couple of the most interesting and kind of like mystical ones, because I think these probably had the most impact on Masonic ritual and the way Freemasonry included and interpreted Jacob's ladder. So we're going to start with Maimonides, who was a Jewish Sephardic philosopher of the 12th century. So Maimonides was it's hard to interpret Maimonides, and in fact, I am nowhere near an expert on him. I have tried to read Maimonides, and he's a difficult. It's a difficult text, but the way that he's usually interpreted is kind of he's either a really conservative mystic, or he's somebody who's sort of against mysticism, and he wrote his book to kind of discredit mysticism and encourage kind of like non-mystical religious experience or something. So I'm not really sure totally how to interpret him, but I do know that his description of the ladder is really interesting. He wrote his most famous book is the Guide for the Perplexed. It has a lot of Aristotelian imagery, and Aristotle had this view of creation that was sort of like emanation based, where you had sort of like a prime mover or the divine source, and things kind of came out of him or it came out of it in layers until you reached creation. So Maimonides talks about angels on Jacob's ladder. There are 4 of them, 2 going up and 2 going down. Maimonides says that the rungs, which he does not number, are as wide as the world, which has been interpreted as sort of representing those layers of creation, or those layers leading back to the divine source, meaning that to climb Jacob's ladder and to sort of take the path of those angels is to ascend back into the upper realms, to sort of like reach God and have some sort of divine experience. So a little while later, we get to the Zohar in the 13th century. I guess it's like 100 years later. So the Zohar is kind of the book that started Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. And my feeling is that there are a lot of Freemasons out there who are really interested in Kabbalah and who are always kind of like looking for ways to connect Kabbalah to Freemasonry. And I think that this particular tradition of interpreting Jacob's ladder in a sort of mystical way is probably the best clue that we have that there is a Masonic connection. Well, maybe not the best, but it's a good one. It's a really good one, and it definitely bears more digging into. So the Zohar, the first one of the largest pieces of the Zohar, which is this huge work, is a kind of mystical, ecstatic interpretation of the Torah. And in this, Jacob's ladder is sort of described as a prophetic dream. And there's a lot of talk about how dream and prophecy are related. And in fact, it says that dreams pervade the entire world, and that each person receives dreams and sees dreams according to his level of virtue. So the more virtuous you are, the more prophetic and more important your dreams are, which sort of says, become virtuous. Like it's telling you to work to be virtuous. The ladder, of course, is still planted in the ground and reaches all the way to heaven, which is seen to be a method of communication between the two worlds below and above. So you have sort of like the higher mystical world and the lower material world. And if you're familiar with Kabbalistic symbolism, it's said to be a connection between Elohim and the Shekhinah. Um, the Zohar also talks about how dreams are sent to us down Jacob's ladder by the Archangel Gabriel, who apparently can also be prayed to help interpret your dreams. And then also the ladder is said to have six rungs. So there are six rungs on the ladder corresponding to six sephirot, which are the nodes on the tree of life, and they are Yesod, Hod, Netzach, Tiferet, Gevurah, and Chesed. So those six sephirot are important because they're also known as the Zair and Pin, or lesser face of God, sort of the small face or the countenance. And these are sort of seen as it's the side of God that is presented to us in Kabbalah, which has sort of like those traits or virtues that God wants us to emulate. So basically, the rungs of the ladder in the Zohar reference all of the attributes of God that we are supposed to also work to take on ourselves. So Freemasonry, there were a lot of as Freemasonry's rituals and symbolism started to develop, there were a lot of English and British scholars who were definitely Protestant and Catholic, but read Hebrew. So we know that there was definitely access to the Zohar and access to a lot of this Kabbalistic stuff in 17th century England. And I think that with a little more digging, it should be pretty easy to find Masons around that time, such as Elias Ashmole, who were way into Freemasonry and way into, the sort of like mystical tradition. But we have an even better thing. So now we're going to depart from Jacob's Ladder and sort of look at this connection between emanationism, or sort of like the layers of creation, or creation as a ladder, and virtue. And what we're going to look at is the Divine Pymander, which was published in 1650. This is the first English translation, excuse me, the first English translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. It was translated by John Everard. It's a very it's readable, but it's an awkward, sort of clumsy translation. However, this would have been coming out right around the time that all of the sort of like gentlemen adopted Masons were joining Freemasonry and looking for Rosicrucianism and looking for sort of like Hermetic traditions in secret societies in England. So they were bringing this influence into Freemasonry at this time, and probably influencing its rituals and influencing how its ritual was interpreted. So in the Divine Pymander, the seventh book is called His Secret Sermon in the Mount of Regeneration. And it's a conversation between Hermes Trismegistus, who's sort of like the main character of the Divine Pymander, and his son Tat. And Hermes has gone through this experience where he has ascended into a state of enlightenment, where he has basically transcended the body, and he's kind of returned to Tat, and he's talking to him as some sort of like spirit or projection or energy creature or something like that. It's not really made clear, except that Hermes no longer has a body, but he's still lecturing his son on how to act right. Hermes talks about the importance of so basically Tad is like, how can I get there? How can I ascend to divinity and reach the state that you're at? And Hermes says the way you do this is by embracing the 10 powers of God that can be experienced to drive out the 12 tormentors. And this prepares the soul for regeneration, and ascent. And so the 10 powers of God are the knowledge of the truth, knowledge of joy, temperance, continence, justice, communion, truth, good, life, and light. And so they're all sort of presented as these sort of like virtuous powers of God that you have to sort of accept in order to drive out all of these tormentors. Um, they're really nebulous and vague compared to, you know, the 7 virtues that we put on the ladder. But this is almost literally described as a way to ascend through the layers of emanation to kind of like reach the divine source and to break through, you know, the layers of reality and see sort of like the house of God. And there's a quote out of this book that I'm going to read here. Thou hast understood, O son, the manner of regeneration. For upon the coming of these 10, meaning the 10 powers of God, the intellectual generation is perfected, and then it driveth away the 12, and we have seen it in the generation itself. Um, this book, however, gets a little, it gets even weirder. So basically, one of the ways that you ascend is by accepting all of these powers of God. The individual mind learns to put on what it calls a fiery body and ascend to the heavens. And this fiery body sheds all of the vices. So all of these things that bog you down, um, which I totally have a list of in here somewhere. Yeah, so nope, that's not the right list. I wish I would have written that down. It's a great list. It's a lot of stuff that you would recognize, like the 7 deadly sins, but there's 12 of them, so there's 5 more in there, and they get even worse and worse. Um, and so this is described in a way that as you ascend, you literally pass through the zodiacal circle, or you reach the star decked canopy, which we talk about in the entered apprentice degree. We say in the star decked, we say that the ladder of Jacob reaches to the star decked heaven. And in the divine Pymander, it describes that in the process of accepting these virtues and shedding these vices, you reach the starry canopy and you pass through it. And in fact, in another part of the divine Pymander, Hermes Trismegistus explains to his son Tat that that once one has learned how to do this, once one has passed through the starry heaven and has accepted all of these virtues, uh, his mind can be properly prepared so that when the body perishes, the mind continues to thrive and becomes part of basically the house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Which we have seen reference to, not in those exact words, but we've seen reference to that both in the Bible, in Masonic ritual, and then here also in this strange 17th century book. So, so through these, I think we can see that there's a pretty good chance that Freemasons who were designing our ritual in the 1600s, or who were writing it and putting all this stuff together, they had access to these books, and we know that they were very interested in Kabbalah, in Hermeticism, and in all of these ideas that were coming out of the Renaissance. So these were literally the texts that they were reading to try to learn how to be better people, learn how to kind of achieve this sort of like divine state. And they brought this information into the craft as they were basically forming it. It was one of those things where they basically created what they were looking for as they were looking for it. All right. Oh, look at that. So now we're going to go forward another 100 years to Benjamin Franklin. So I think most American Freemasons have a pretty good idea of Benjamin Franklin's contribution to the craft. He was the first Grand Master in Pennsylvania. He was the publisher of the first Masonic book published in the United States, or I mean, it was 1734. So in America, in the New World. Um, he was a really prolific writer. He, he published newspapers. He did a bunch of important stuff, and um, he wasn't necessarily always a really deep philosophical thinker when it came to kind of like mystical stuff. In fact, I would kind of argue that he wasn't much of a mystic, and when he did try to embrace mysticism, he did a very poor job. But one thing that he was really focused on was trying to be a better person. And we know, of course, from the stories of Benjamin Franklin, that he was a man who was plagued with incredible vices, as well as like a drive to create and succeed. So he kind of had like uh he kind of was a man of extremes. But one of the things that he wrote about in his autobiography, which I think should be required reading for every American Mason, is his goal of arriving at moral perfection. And this is sort of an approach to spirituality that is incredibly practical, which in my mind makes it slot really well into Freemasonry. It's a type of approach to spirituality that involves active change in the world and stuff that basically does good for your fellow humans and and creates sort of like an example for others to follow, while in addition making you into a better person. And this has been written about a bunch. You can find books about Benjamin Franklin's Art of Virtue with some really good descriptions of the method, but I'm still going to describe it to you because it's fairly simple. So Benjamin Franklin's Art of Virtue, in this, he takes a list of 13 virtues and he focuses on one each week. And during that week, he has basically a little checklist, which I'll show on the next slide. And he kind of keeps track of his progress. And this allows him to circle through those 13 virtues 4 times a year, which is cool because 13 is a Masonic number, and we love Masonic numbers. In numbers in general, it's a Masonic thing. And here's the list of the virtues that Benjamin Franklin writes about in his autobiography: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, humility, and that was only 12. And a 13th, which apparently I didn't write down. Yeah, anyhow. It's probably on here. H is humility. Who knows what I left out? In any case, so you can see here, this is sort of his check boxes for his week of temperance. And this practice is pretty straightforward. Basically, each week you pick one virtue and you focus on it. And what you do for this virtue is you write about it. So you basically, what he would do is he would just write like these little sentences. Like for temperance, he wrote, "Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation." um, you would sort of like keep that on a piece of paper by your bed, and you would look at it in the morning and maybe write a little bit about the virtue of temperance. During the day, you would try to keep temperance in your mind. And then in the evening before you went to bed, you would pull out your journal and you would give yourself a little check mark if you were good at it or bad at it. And his is a little more complicated, where he keeps track of all of the 13 virtues every time. He just wants to make sure that he does good on the virtue that he's focusing on. So again, you do this for 13 weeks and then you start over. This particular practice has been adopted by other traditions, such as Musar, which is a Jewish kind of semi-mystical virtue practice. It's been adopted. It eventually sort of morphed into what became modern self-help movement stuff, where you have kind of like these methods of assuring yourself that you can be better. And it's all sort of based around this thing where you focus on the virtue and not on the vice. And you try for small incremental change. So instead of just like waking up one day after your spree of being like the world's greatest con man and saying, I will never lie again. You'd be like, okay, I'm going to lie to one fewer people today. And then the next time it comes around, you'd be like, okay, I'm going to lie to 2 fewer people today. And you just work on that over and over again. And you do an incremental improvement instead of all of it at once. Hopefully we don't have any con men like that in Freemasonry. I just needed a extreme example to kind of show you guys what I was talking about. And one thing you can do with this in order to kind of mesh it into a Masonic practice is you can replace these 13 with 13 Masonic virtues. This is a really surprisingly easy thing to do, because even though we tend to focus on those 7 main virtues in the entered apprentice degree, we have virtues around every corner, and it doesn't take very long. Like, the next time you see a Masonic lecture, just count the virtues and you'll get probably 15 of them out of each degree. So there's a long list of stuff to look at and a long list of things to pay attention to. And you can even pull stuff to contemplate out of the different Masonic degrees. And then sort of work through this. And it's actually a really good practice to do as a lodge, where the lodge can, for instance, have a virtue that they focus on each month, and they can discuss it in lodge, and people, if they feel like it, they can share successes or failures in practicing the virtue, or even ask each other for help, because as Masons, that's kind of what we're here to do. So Franklin wrote about this, and he did admit that it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And this is a method that I've tried to practice as well. And it's something that I can do for short periods of time, but I've never managed to make it through a whole year. I think the longest I've ever managed to do in one continuous chunk was probably like 6 or 7 months. But the focus on the virtues and sort of the method of being mindful of them and keeping them in your head, I believe does end up making you a better person. So I hope that this is a sort of thing that can show you that I think that the sort of this particular practice does a good job of tying into some of the esoteric and kind of mystical symbolism in Freemasonry, while still showing you that Freemasonry offers you kind of an operative way of improving yourself in the world that can make you better as a man and Mason, while still allowing you to kind of like explore some of the mysteries of Freemasonry in their most esoteric and mysterious aspects. And thank you. Oops, I forgot to change this last slide. You guys don't tip me. I just want to say thank you. This was that's my talk, and I would love to answer any questions that you guys have.
This is Brother Angel. I'm the chaplain at Hibiscus, number 275. I wanted to say thank you, Worshipful. That was a very good lecture. Just a little FYI. So I remember you saying the cube that that Jacobs was using as his pillow. I'm actually compiling a very lengthy, extremely esoteric lecture on the cube, and that cube itself is a cube of Saturn. It's
oh yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. You'll be surprised at how prominent it is around the world, actually. But yeah, that was a very good. Is a very, very good lecture. Thank you for that.
Oh yeah, I'm glad. That sounds interesting. Let me know when you got that done. I want to see that talk.
Yeah.
Worshipful. First and foremost, thank you so much for the presentation. That was a very good presentation, very engaging and exciting. The virtues, I think, were I don't know if so. It's temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility.
So moderation is the one that I left out.
Yeah, because I actually mentioned them in my presentation too. I believe it's chapter 9 of his autobiography that he talks about the journal entries that he was doing in to cultivate those virtues.
Yeah, I feel it. Yeah, I think it's in. It's pretty easy to find. His autobiography isn't very big, and it's really fascinating. But he does a good job talking about it.
Because one connection that I was making, I know it's a little bit out there, but that was the way that I was interpreting it. I was interpreting it with because we're talking about the Ashlers, you have the rough Ashlar and the perfect Ashlar, and we know that to get from the rough Ashlar to the perfect Ashlar, it's through I believe it's a virtuous education, the Mason's own efforts, and I believe the blessings of God, right?
Yeah,
So I think that in writing the way that I interpreted it, in writing his autobiography, I think it was that he was leaving he was leaving behind instructions for his son as he was growing up to become like a morally and intellectually like perfect individual. So I thought that was almost like his own tracing board, right? Of like
yeah.
leaving behind to his son as an initiate of the world to like become a morally and intellectually perfect individual.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I was also, I was just sort of struck by this thought of like, as you accept the vices, you shed, or as you accept the virtues, you shed the vices. And in coming to the perfect ashlar, we talk about getting rid of the superfluous parts of the stone. So that, and then Brother Castro asks, do you think Jacob's ladder imagery was imported from the Bible, or do you think another source? I think it definitely came from the Bible, but I think also that at that period of time in England, you had a lot of people realizing that it wasn't just the clergy that got to interpret the Bible. So you had people, looking to other sources to find interpretations or to find ways to understand some of the imagery in the Bible. So I think that's probably what happened. Especially Freemasons, who at the time were kind of like, the last Renaissance men, and so they were really into a lot of European mystical traditions.
I think it's almost interesting as well. It's not really so much a question, but just that Gabriel passes down dreams. So it's not so
Yeah.
much like an internal experience, but now it's like an external thing that someone just like gives you. You know, so I don't know. I've always found that idea.
So I've been to interject. I've been practicing a little bit of ceremonial magic myself, and it's funny enough. The four angels that you call upon, which are Gabriel, Uriel, Raphael, and Michael, they all have different attributes. So Uriel is said to be known to give mankind the Kabbalah itself, which I found very, very interesting because they all have different attributes. It's water, fire, earth, and air, and then there's spirit, but that's like aether and stuff.
Ether, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know that I've necessarily seen the reference about Uriel giving the Kabbalah, but having Gabriel associated with dreams is really common because he ends up being associated with the moon, who's long sort of had this kind of like dream association. So that's kind of a really cool thing. Yeah, I think probably so. The reason I started thinking about the Jacob's Ladder stuff and kind of dwelling on it for so long is this awesome lecture that Chris Murphy gave, which has to happen inside a tiled lodge, and you guys should totally bring him down to Florida and tell him that you want to see you want him to give his talk that has Jacob's Ladder in it, because it was kind of a mind blower for me. But it totally, like when he was talking about it, I was suddenly reminded like, this is in the Corpus Hermeticum. So yeah, that idea of the ascent, sort of like breaking through the different spheres and returning up to, it's sort of like looking at the rungs of the ladder as the different spheres of influence to return to the divine source is is really, really common in the Western mystery tradition. So it ends up being kind of represented in a lot of different ways. And you'll see it in Kabbalah, for instance, as the kind of like nested spheres of the tree of life, or you'll see it in like alchemical traditions or even like astrological traditions as the spheres of the planets that you have to ascend through, and each one has different vices and virtues associated with it, and you identify with the virtues and shed the vices in order to kind of like return to the divine source. So you see that theme a lot. And spending a little bit of time kind of just reading the Entered Apprentice lecture, this is something that is a constant learning process for me with the Masonic ritual, is that sometimes it's really, really plain. Like it really just says something and it means it. And I think that's one of the things that you see in the Jacob's Ladder thing, where it basically just says, no, this is how you get back to the divine source. You do exactly this. And it just tells you right there. And when I finally saw that, I was like, oh man, I got initiated 20 years ago. I never noticed that.
I wasn't even. I had never even noticed that the first 4 steps are the four cardinal virtues. I hadn't.
Yeah.
I never noticed that.
We never say it in the ritual, but it happens in Masonic artwork all the time. So yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye out for sure. Let's see. Henry says, I see Franklin's 13 virtues as his center of moral gravity. Yeah, I think Franklin sort of says that pretty plainly. Like he wants his virtue practice to be his path to moral perfection, but he also admits in his autobiography that he fails. And we know just from history that he didn't always do such a good job of being virtuous.
Have any other questions?
Hellfire Club.
Oh yeah. Or his whole like string of French girlfriends.
Yeah, he was a scientist. You have to remember that. And Masons are free thinkers. Science back then was more. I'm not going to get political at all, but science has been because of certain things in society and whatnot, with more so feelings and stuff. Certain papers aren't being written like X, Y, and Z. But back then it was completely raw. Like you could have corpses. He had like 6 corpses under his his apartment, something like that.
His house in London. He was renting it out to a doctor who was probably buying corpses from Resurrection Man at the time. But it's pretty fascinating. But and Franklin, he was definitely a man of the Enlightenment, and he spent a lot of time, kind of like debunking mesmerism. He did a lot of really important early work on electricity and stuff like that. He was
He pushed the envelope.
He did. He pushed the envelope a lot, and he was an inventor. I mean, he was all over the place.
Jack of all trades.
Definitely, and he was really good at a lot of them. But he was also a jerk. Like he was not a nice guy. If you read about the stuff that he was publishing in his newspapers and the way that he went after his competitors, the way that he went after like his own family and stuff, like he was really used to. I think he thought that he was always the smartest guy in the room. And I think that he thought that he always had to get his way. And I think that those were some things. Yeah, probably a lot of time he was. Yeah, for sure. But his the book that he published, the first Masonic book that was published in America, was Anderson's Constitutions, and you can get a scanned PDF of it off of archive.org. It's great reading. That should also be, so definitely get a copy of that. It's
what was it again?
Anderson's Constitutions of Freemasonry.
Anderson.
And I think it's 1934 Yeah, you can find it on archive.org or like every Masonic website that collects PDFs.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yep. I have a whole file for PDFs and whatnot, which I can share as well. So this is going to be one of my to-dos just now. Yes. Which, by the way, thank you so much for the presentation, brother. It was fantastic. I don't even know if I skipped maybe like one or two of your slides. The first one or two, I think I got in like 15 minutes late.
Okay.
What did it cover? Just to recap.
The first two slides, it was Jacob's Ladder in Freemasonry. So I talked about Christopher Wren's Catechism from 1685, and then William Preston's Illustrations of Masonry, and then we just sort of looked at some of the symbolism in that print of Jacob's Ladder.
Okay. After the Catechism in the 15th century, what was it again? Just so.
William Preston's Illustrations of Masonry, which is the book that our lectures are based on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, got it.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to stop my recording now. Thank you guys. This has been really amazing.